But analytic philosophy is boring.
Can I bring you back to, so the point that Genia raised was that philosophy should be committed to values of clarity and rigor, all philosophy across the different areas. Do you disagree with that
Yes,
claim?
of course I disagree with that, because who's judging?
If you ask who judges, you've just said the most judgmental thing of all, namely that analytic philosophy is boring.
I came here just now from Heidelberg, and I know for a fact that you need, if you get an American fellowship to study, to teach, or visit Germany, you no longer need to learn German. And you don't need to learn German, and I've taught at the Humboldt, and I old-fashionedly taught in German, and then I realized that my German colleagues were speaking bad English, and I said, well, I can do that a little better. So I switched. And so there is, I think, a linguistic ascendancy, and the ascendancy is definite, it's completely accurate, it's completely true, and Germans spend a lot of time trying to find out how they can get their work in English positions. I've also been visiting Germany since 1984. So that means for a very long time, and what I wanted to do was German philosophy of science, which I discovered when I arrived had not existed. It had already gone over to the analytic side. There was only analytic philosophy of science. And I said, well, if I could do that in England better, or I could do that in the United States. The problem for me, my teacher was someone named Gadamer. The problem for me, and the problem still is, where do you get your teachers? And one can assume, oh yes, analytic philosophers can teach you how to read Nietzsche. But I would say they really can't, because you cannot read, it's just a logical problem of solicism. You cannot read Nietzsche in translation. You can, but you'll be reading a lovely man, Reg Hollingdale. You will not be reading Nietzsche, or a not so nice man, Walter Kaufmann. You will not, he earns his name, he's a salesman. He sold Nietzsche to everyone as someone who was not really Nazi, so he's very good. But that's the problem. So for me, the distinction's over, because everyone has died. So it's a serious problem. Who are actual continental philosophers? You're looking at one, but there are not a lot of them, and I'm not long for this world. So, and it makes all the difference that I had the teachers that I had. I can't invent myself, and analytic philosophers couldn't have taught me how to read. Why was Gadamer so important? Not because he was Gadamer and wrote Truth and Method. He wrote that when he was 60. Because he was a philologist. Because I had studied Greek. Because Nietzsche was a scholar of Greek. And that's why Bernard Williams, for example, was so interested in Nietzsche, because Richard Betts, same thing, very analytic, Johns Hopkins. Nietzsche's someone who read the Greeks in Greek. If you don't read Aristotle in Greek, you cannot understand his argument. If you don't read Plato in Greek, you cannot understand his argument. If you translate it into English, someone somewhere along the line, except for the Cambridge edition, will vary the word. And then the argument falls apart. And it's the same problem with Heidegger, with Nietzsche, and thank you. But that's where I stand. We're over by default. It's the farewell concerto. They have left the building. Yes.
I think you've made yourself clear, Babette. Thank you. So now we move to our first theme, and again, we'll move to our speakers in turn. So our first theme is there value in having different schools of philosophical thought, or is philosophy necessarily all-encompassing? And I'm going to turn to you first, Genia.
Yes, so in typical philosophical mode, I might ask, what does it mean for philosophy to be all-encompassing? But if that means there can only be one way of looking at things, I think that's wrong. Philosophy is obviously the discipline that challenges just one way of doing things. It always comes up with new perspectives, new objections, things that you haven't thought of before. So I think a diversity of approaches is definitely a good thing. However, I do think that all philosophers either are or ought to be committed to values like rigor, clarity, originality, etc. So I think a similar core in values, but not necessarily the same approach or the same methodology.
Thank you, Babette. You're making some quite distinct faces here. I think you've got a strong opinion.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to react. It's very hard not to because it's such a persuasive, clear, and very well-argued position. So that is, for me, overwhelming. Except in this, and I speak as a veteran of philosophy departments for a long time. We've hired analytic philosophers exclusively at Fordham University. Since I was hired, I think they hired me by accident. I certainly guaranteed that accident because I needed the job. But analytic philosophy is boring. So this is the real problem with it. It is not exciting. And I teach at a Jesuit university where the Jesuits, because of theology, require philosophy because of theology. Not anymore. We have just abolished the requirement, thank you, analytic philosophy, and I agree with that. No one should be forced to take a course in analytic philosophy. It's not necessary. You don't need it. You can learn to reason from a mathematician, I hope you would, or a physicist or a biologist. I was trained in biology. I don't think philosophy has a monopoly on that, so I think we can get it from there. And the problem with the boring factor is how do you get, I studied at Stony Brook because of biology. If it weren't Continental, we wouldn't have had a philosophy department. People took the classes because they wanted to, because they were exciting. That's what you need. At Fordham, they're forced. Not anymore. Will we still have the
Babette, can I bring you back to, so the point that Genia raised was that philosophy should be committed to values of clarity and rigor, all philosophy across the different areas. Do you disagree with that
yes,
claim?
Of course I disagree with that, because who's judging? Honestly, I mean, I can appreciate it, but it doesn't mean I'm judging it. Would it be the rigor for my standards? Maybe not. I already said you need all that depth and all that history.
Can I say something?
Go for it.
So, I mean, if you ask who judges, you've just said the most judgmental thing of all, namely that analytic philosophy is boring. So I think that's just a caricature view. Some analytic philosophers might be boring, but good analytic philosophy is just good philosophy and therefore isn't boring. And trying to figure out the solutions to important questions isn't boring. I mean, you don't have to write in Nietzsche aphorisms to be classed as not boring. And I admire Nietzsche, and I myself work on people like Kierkegaard and Wittgenstein. So it's not like I'm this paradigmatic, evil analytic philosopher, but yeah. So I think that statement can't go unchallenged.
Well, I was only thinking of the students.
Well, the students on the whole like interesting philosophy of mind courses, for example. So I think that's not true either, I'm afraid.
So not all analytic philosophy is boring. That's your bold claim here.
Yes, absolutely. So controversial.
Christoph, sitting comfortably here with your popcorn on the sidelines. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on the point about clarity and rigor, because I think it's true that analytic philosophy has presented itself often as having a special commitment to clarity and rigor, as if almost they had some sort of monopoly on these virtues. And I think we too easily let them have this claim, in the sense that there's a great deal of analytic philosophy that's actually not clear and that's actually not rigorous. One way in which analytic philosophy is often not so rigorous as it claims to be is that the place where analytic philosophers often rest their arguments are what they themselves call their intuitions. So they will sit in a seminar room and they will exchange with each other what their intuitive beliefs are about certain things. Sometimes you're told that when people say intuitions, really they mean something like basic beliefs, which is fine as well as a term. You know, people's basic beliefs, which they essentially dogmatically then rest their arguments on. So that's a case where I think we should question whether there's the rigor that we traditionally demand of the very idea of philosophy in analytic philosophy. And I think often actually we find that there are great communicators on the side of continental philosophy. So if you read the work, for example, of someone like Graham Harman, there's a kind of display of these virtues of clear communication. They're very difficult to find in the kind of standard papers that we now expect in analytic philosophy, where often so many qualifications are built into what the person's trying to say because of the pressures of academic publishing, where you have to say something that's different from what any other person has ever said, which is quite difficult to do unless you model what you're saying basically on what other people have said, and then you build in lots of little qualifications, so that it's actually very difficult. It's often, in my experience anyway, very difficult to know what's actually being communicated. So I think that's an area where it's important not to let analytic philosophy just have these claims and let them be unexamined. And I think at its extreme, it can be a form of, to pick up on a word that Babette used earlier, colonialism or colonization, because the feature of the colonial mindset is that from within the colonial mindset, there is no outside. Right? This is the way that things are done. Now, you can participate in that if you like, but there are certain conditions of entry, and the conditions of entry have to do with things like talking like us. Right, and in the old days, there was much more in analytic philosophy of trying to make things straightforward and not using horrible jargon, and that's a great thing, I think. But it's just no longer really viable to say about the work that's done in analytic philosophy on the whole that it avoids jargon. That's just there's a great deal of it, and it's presented in a certain way, and very, often in short sentences that. Where the style is very repetitive and sort of reminiscent of scientific papers. But it doesn't mean that jargon is actually not being used. It's just being smuggled in, I think, often.
Thank you. I wonder whether you want to come back on that. And I'm curious that both Babette and Christoph have used this idea of the colonization that analytic philosophy may or may not be.
Yeah. So, I mean, I totally agree. It's by no means... true that just because you say you're an analytic philosopher, therefore you know how to do clarity and rigor. And I also completely agree that all this talk about intuitions is, to use a strong word, quite ridiculous. I always say when kind of PhD students talk about their intuitions, I kind of say, well, I'm not really interested in your intuitions or your feelings. Give me an argument for why that's a good view. So yeah, I agree. And I think actually the worst problem with contemporary analytic philosophy, in my mind, is that they've forgotten all the brilliant Wittgensteinian lessons. And I think that's also why all of the jargon has now kind of started to dominate, because a lot of the stuff that, for example, went on in ordinary language philosophy in Oxford, although I want to stress, contrary to what people think, Wittgenstein was actually not an ordinary language philosopher, but obviously that line of philosophy was very much influenced by Wittgenstein. But there's now a positive hatred of Wittgenstein in the contemporary philosophical scene, in particular in analytic philosophy. And I think that is partly to blame for the way in which things have gone. So I agree with Christoph that there's no monopoly here, and also no implication that, if you work on continental stuff, you can't be clear and rigorous. But I do think one ought to kind of commit to those values and try to be clear and rigorous. But it certainly doesn't go without saying that just because you're an analytic philosopher, you can do that. You might end up churning out all sorts of nonsense. So, yeah.
Could I just add something very brief about Wittgenstein?
Very briefly.
So it's very interesting you mentioned Wittgenstein and the Wittgenstein hatred. I think it's a fascinating phenomenon. And there are Italian scholars who've done empirical studies of how people got their jobs in America based on what PhDs they'd done. And the best thing that you could write your PhD on was themes from the philosophy of David Lewis. That's not surprising. Right? The most influential philosopher at Princeton in the 1970s. And the worst thing you could write your dissertation on by that time was Wittgenstein. And I think and that tells us something very, very interesting, because, as somebody that's not part of the kind of an academic industrial complex, you might think, well, one of the key figures of the analytic tradition is Wittgenstein. But this is not how it's seen from within. And even there's this tendency for analytic philosophers to sort of project Wittgenstein outwards from their tradition and call him a continental philosopher, which is a very curious thing. I mean, there are ways in which Wittgenstein's thought, and you'll know way more about this than I do, has its roots in particular Viennese culture, and so in that sense it's continental European in its influences in all sorts of ways. But if Wittgenstein's not a central figure in the analytic tradition, sort of who is? So.
Completely agree.
I want to move us in a slightly different direction to think about, I guess.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below.
With a free trial, you can enjoy the full talk and thousands more.
Thank you for being part of the conversation.